During my father's funeral, my uncles didn't realize I could hear them. The fool has no idea we changed Dad's will last month. Everything goes to us. Instead of that disappointment, they were laughing next to my father's casket. I got angry and said nothing. This morning, my phone blew up with 26 missed calls from all of them. Honestly, never thought I'd be posting here, but after what happened yesterday, I just need to get this off my chest. Sorry for any formatting issues. Typing this on my phone while hiding in my dad's bathroom. Yeah, it's that kind of morning. So my dad passed away last week after fighting pancreatic cancer for 8 months. He was 63, too young, but cancer doesn't give a shit about your retirement plans, I guess. Dad and I had this complicated relationship. He wasn't the hugging type, more the get up, stop crying, figure it out kind of father. But beneath all that tough love was a solid respect between us. He pushed me because he believed I could handle it. At least that's what I choose to believe now that he's gone. The funeral was yesterday at Oak Ridge Memorial. Standard stuff, closed casket because Dad looked like hell at the end. His words, not mine. He made me promise not to let people gawk at his corpse, as he put it. There were maybe 40 people there. Dad wasn't exactly Mr. Popular, but he had his circle. After the service, I needed a minute alone. Just overwhelmed, you know? Not even sure what I was feeling. Numb, mostly. 8 months of watching someone fade is like emotional sandpaper. Wears you down until there's nothing left. I wandered into this little side room off the main hall. The funeral home had these little alcoves with comfortable chairs where people could sit and collect themselves. I sank into one of those overstuffed armchairs in the corner, closed my eyes, and just breathed. That's when I heard them. The connecting door to the viewing room was cracked open, and my uncles Thomas and Beckett came in, their voices floating through before I could even process who was talking. Uncle Thomas was mid-sentence. And the way he looked at me during the service, like I'm supposed to feel sorry for him or something. He's always been soft, Uncle Beckett replied. Walter takes after his mother, not our side. I froze. They were talking about me. I should have made my presence known, but something in their tone, I just stayed still. The fool has no idea we changed Dad's will last month, Thomas said, and I could practically hear the smile in his voice. Everything goes to us instead of that disappointment. They were literally standing next to my dad's casket, laughing. He thinks he's getting the house, the business, everything, Beckett added. Wait till Monday when Bill reads the will. The look on his face will be priceless. Best decision we ever made, Thomas said. Catching Dad when he was all doped up on those pain meds. He'd sign anything by that point. My blood went cold. The room started spinning a little. They manipulated my dying father. When he was medicated, I gripped the armrest so hard my knuckles went white. Walter couldn't even run a lemonade stand, Beckett said. Dad's company would be bankrupt in a year with him in charge. Thomas laughed again. Well, it's not his problem anymore. I already told Maureen we won't be needing her services after next week. No reason to keep Dad's charity cases on the payroll. Maureen? Dad's housekeeper for the last 15 years? The woman who basically moved in to help care for him during chemo? They were firing her? I sat there, literally shaking with rage. Not being dramatic. I looked down and my hands were trembling. But I didn't say a word. Didn't burst in. Didn't confront them. Just listened as they went on and on about how they'd protected the family legacy from me. Eventually, someone called for them, and they left. I sat there for maybe another 20 minutes trying to process what I'd heard. I'm not going to lie to Reddit. I wanted to follow them out to the parking lot and beat them both into the pavement. The image of my uncles laughing next to my father's casket while they plotted to steal my inheritance. It's burned into my brain. But I didn't. Because my dad always said, never start a fight until you know exactly how you're going to end it. And right then, I had no clue what to do. So I made it through the rest of the funeral somehow. Accepted condolences, nodded at all the "he was such a good man" comments. Thanked everyone for coming. All while my uncles watched me with these smug little smiles, probably thinking about how they'd pulled one over on both me and my dad. After everyone left, I drove to my dad's house. Our house, technically. I grew up there. Every corner holds some memory, good and bad. The dining room where Dad would drill me on math problems. The backyard where he taught me to throw a football, badly. Neither of us were athletic. The garage where we restored that old Chevy when I was 16. When I walked in, I found Maureen in the kitchen, eyes red from crying. She looked startled to see me, like she hadn't expected anyone to come by. "Oh, Walter," she said, wiping quickly at her face. "I was just cleaning up a bit. You okay?" I asked, even though it was obvious she wasn't. She hesitated, then just shook her head. "Your uncle stopped by this morning, before the funeral. They told me I should start looking for another position. Said once the will is read on Monday, they'll be taking over everything and won't need me anymore." I felt that rage building again. "They have no right?" "It's okay," she interrupted. "Your father prepared me for this possibility. He told me those vultures would try to swoop in the moment he was gone." She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I just thought we'd have more time." We talked for a while longer. Turns out Dad had been worried about his brothers for months. According to Maureen, they started visiting more frequently once Dad got really sick, but only when I wasn't around. Always bringing paperwork, always insisting on privacy. Maureen also mentioned something about a safety deposit box, but didn't know details, just that Dad had been adamant about keeping some papers there, away from the house. I stayed at Dad's place last night. Couldn't bear the thought of going back to my empty apartment. Ended up falling asleep on the couch around 3 in the morning after looking through old photo albums. Woke up this morning to my phone blowing up. 26 missed calls. 26 from Uncle Thomas, Uncle Beckett, their wives, even my cousins, plus about 40 text messages asking where I was and demanding I call back immediately. I haven't responded to any of them. Not yet. But something must have happened. Something that has them panicking. And you know what? For the first time since I heard them laughing by my father's casket, I felt something other than rage. I felt hope. Whatever's got them freaking out might be exactly what I need to fight back. Because I'm not letting them steal what Dad wanted me to have. And I'm definitely not letting them fire Maureen or anyone else who was loyal to my father. Dad taught me to pick my battles, to wait for the right moment, to never throw the first punch unless I'm sure I can end the fight. Well, I think that moment might be coming sooner than my uncles expected. We'll update once I figure out what's got them so desperate to reach me. Something tells me this is just the beginning. Update 1. First, I just want to say thanks for all the support on my last post. Didn't expect so many people to care about my family drama TBH. Reading your comments helped me feel less crazy about this whole situation. So, 26 missed calls. I finally checked the voicemails around noon yesterday after ignoring them all morning. Most were variations of Uncle Thomas and Uncle Beckett, demanding I call them back ASAP about an urgent family matter. The last one from Thomas was just him yelling that I needed to stop being childish and answer my damn phone. Childish? That's rich coming from someone who was giggling like a 12-year-old next to my father's casket. Instead of calling them back, I texted my friend Diego. We've known each other since middle school, and he's been my go-to person for advice since forever. Plus, he knows a ton about legal stuff. Not saying why, but trust me, he's the guy you want in your corner. While waiting for Diego, I started going through Dad's home office. Not sure what I was looking for exactly, but I needed to do something. The room still smelled like him, that mix of coffee and the weird, pine-scented hand sanitizer he was obsessed with. His reading glasses were still on the desk next to a half-filled crossword puzzle. That's when I remembered our last real conversation, about 3 weeks before he died. Before the pain meds turned him into basically a shell. I'd been sitting with him, trying to get him to eat something. Those hospital protein shakes that smell like wet cardboard. Out of nowhere, he grabbed my wrist, still had a strong grip despite everything, and told me he needed to make sure I understood something. He said that Thomas and Beckett had been sniffing around like vultures lately, said they'd always been jealous that Granddad had left Dad in charge of the family business instead of splitting it 3 ways. Dad told me he'd made arrangements to protect what was mine, but needed me to promise I'd fight if they tried anything. I thought he was just being paranoid from the meds. Now I realize he was having one of his last lucid moments, trying to warn me. Diego showed up around 2, and I unloaded everything. What I overheard at the funeral, Maureen's situation, the 26 calls, all of it. He didn't interrupt, just took notes on his phone while I talked. When I finished, the first thing Diego asked was whether Dad had a regular nurse toward the end. That's when I remembered Kendra. Kendra had been Dad's home nurse for the final 2 months. Young woman, maybe mid-20s, with those colorful scrubs and always playing lofi beats on her phone while she worked. Dad actually liked her, said she didn't treat him like he was made of glass. I still had her number in my contacts. Called her right there with Diego listening. She seemed surprised to hear from me, but was super helpful. Told me that, yes, my uncles had visited multiple times in Dad's final weeks, but only when I wasn't there. Said they always insisted on private time with Dad, even when she told them he was heavily medicated. The kicker? Kendra said the last time they visited must have been when they got him to sign whatever they're claiming is the new will. Dad wasn't even fully conscious. She said she walked in once during their private time to check his vitals and saw Thomas holding Dad's hand with a pen, guiding it across some document while Beckett and some guy she didn't recognize watched. She thought it was weird, but figured it was just family business. When she mentioned it to Maureen later, Maureen tried to call me, but I was stuck in traffic and missed the call. By the time I checked my voicemail and called back, Dad had had a bad night, and it got lost in the chaos. Diego looked like he was about to say something when my phone started blowing up again. Thomas and Beckett calling from Thomas's house. I almost ignored it, but Diego suggested I answer and record the call. He reminded me our state only requires one-party consent, so it's totally legal. I put it on speaker. Thomas started immediately with how I needed to come to his house right now to discuss the will reading scheduled for Monday. Said there were complications they needed to address as a family before meeting with the lawyer. I played dumb. asked what kind of complication. Beckett jumped in. Guess I was on speaker on their end too, saying something about paperwork irregularities and how, for everyone's benefit, we should present a united front. The whole time they were talking, I could hear this edge of panic in their voices. These guys who were laughing at my dad's funeral now sounded like they were about to have heart attacks. I told them I'd meet them at Dad's house in an hour. Their reaction? Complete silence for like 5 seconds. Then Thomas stammering that his place would be more appropriate. I insisted on Dad's house. They reluctantly agreed. After hanging up, Diego and I did a quick sweep of Dad's office, looking for anything that might explain what had my uncles so freaked out. That's when I found it, tucked inside Dad's copy of The Old Man and the Sea, his favorite book. He made me read it like 3 times growing up. It was a small black moleskin notebook, Dad's journal from the past year. I only had time to skim it before Thomas and Beckett were due to arrive. But holy shit, the entries from the last 6 months were basically a documentary of my uncle's gradual attempts to manipulate him. Dad had documented everything. Their visits, their suggestions about changing his will, their comments about me being unready to take over the business. The last coherent entry, dated just before he went on the heavy pain meds, mentioned a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown and instructions to make sure Walter gets the key from Maureen. Before I could process this, the doorbell rang. Thomas and Beckett stood there looking like they'd aged 10 years overnight. Thomas had this fake smile plastered on his face. Beckett couldn't even look me in the eye. Diego stayed in the kitchen while I led my uncles to the living room. They did not look happy to see Maureen still there, cleaning up some dishes. Thomas made some comment about unnecessary staff expenses during this transition period, which I ignored. Once we sat down, Thomas started this whole speech about how they had concerns about the will reading on Monday. Said there might be some surprising developments that could upset the family dynamic. Mentioned how Dad had made some last-minute changes that might seem out of character. I just sat there, letting them dig themselves deeper. Finally, Beckett blurted out that they were worried I might overreact when I learned Dad had changed his will to leave controlling interest in the company to them, with me getting only a generous stipend. That's when I asked, as innocently as possible, when exactly Dad had made these changes. Thomas said it was about 3 weeks ago when Dad was perfectly lucid and aware of what he was doing. I nodded, then asked why they were so concerned about my reaction if everything was legal and above board. The look they exchanged, if I hadn't already known they were lying, that look would have confirmed it. They started backpedaling, saying they just wanted to prepare me and make sure I understood Dad's reasoning. Thomas even had the nerve to say Dad had told them he was disappointed in my life choices and didn't trust me with his legacy. I almost lost it right there. Almost showed them the journal. Almost told them about Kendra. But Diego's earlier advice echoed in my head. Don't show your cards until you've seen theirs. So I just nodded again and told them I appreciated their concern, but would wait to hear the will directly from the lawyer on Monday. Then, I basically showed them out, ignoring their attempts to keep the conversation going. After they left, Diego came out of the kitchen with the biggest grin on his face, told me he'd recorded the whole conversation on his phone. We now had them on record basically admitting they were worried about something. I called Maureen in and asked about the safety deposit box key. Her eyes got wide, and she disappeared upstairs, returning 5 minutes later with a small envelope. Inside was a key and a note in Dad's handwriting. Walter, in case of emergency, trust only yourself. Diego and I went straight to the bank, but it was already closed for the week. I'll have to wait until Monday morning to see what's in that box. Later that night, I got a text from Diego saying he'd reached out to one of Dad's old business partners, a guy named Frank who'd retired last year. Frank agreed to meet us for breakfast tomorrow. Apparently, he has some interesting stories about my uncle's business practices that might be relevant to our situation. I'm writing this from Dad's kitchen at 2 a.m. because I can't sleep. The house feels different now. Not just empty because Dad's gone, but like it's waiting for something. For Monday, maybe. I don't know exactly what's in that safety deposit box. I don't know what Frank is going to tell us tomorrow. But for the first time since the funeral, I feel like maybe, just maybe, Dad was one step ahead of his brothers all along. We'll update after we meet Frank and check the safety deposit box. Something tells me my uncle's 26 desperate phone calls were just the beginning of their problems. Finally, update. Sorry for the delay, everyone. The past week has been a total roller coaster. I'm typing this from Dad's study. No, my study now. Still feels weird to say that. So when I left off, I was about to meet Frank, Dad's old business partner, for breakfast. Then head to the bank to check out whatever Dad left in that safety deposit box. I was legit running on like 2 hours of sleep and enough caffeine to kill a horse. But there was no way I was missing either appointment. Frank chose this little diner downtown, the kind with vinyl booths that make that weird squeaky noise when you slide in and waitresses who call everyone hun. He was already there when I arrived. nursing what looked like his third cup of coffee, judging by the empty creamers scattered around. First impression, not what I expected. Frank was this short, balding guy with thick glasses and a cardigan that had seen better days. Doesn't exactly scream successful businessman, but Dad always said appearances were the best disguise. Frank didn't waste time with small talk. While I was still trying to decide between pancakes and waffles, he slid a manila folder across the table. Turns out Frank has been keeping records of every shady thing my uncles have done at the company for the past decade. Nothing illegal exactly, but definitely unethical. Times they tried to override Dad's decisions, clients they attempted to poach, even a failed attempt to get board members to vote Dad out 3 years ago when he was first diagnosed. But the real bombshell? Dad knew. He'd known for years. And he'd been documenting everything himself, building what Frank called an insurance policy. According to Frank, Dad never trusted his brothers, not since they tried to convince their father, my grandfather, to sell the company back in the 90s. Dad was the only one who wanted to keep it in the family, and Grandpa sided with him. Thomas and Beckett never forgave either of them. As Frank talked, something clicked in my head. This wasn't just about inheritance or money. This was a grudge that had been festering for 30 years. We finished breakfast, went with the pancakes, BTW needed the sugar rush, and I headed straight to First National. Diego met me there, looking surprisingly put together for a Sunday morning. Meanwhile, I probably looked like I'd been hit by a truck and dragged a few miles. The safety deposit box contained exactly 3 things: a USB drive, a sealed envelope addressed to William Chen, attorney at law, a letter addressed simply to Walter. I opened my letter right there in the bank's private viewing room. It was dated just 2 months ago when Dad was still lucid, but knew he didn't have much time left. The letter wasn't long, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. Walter, if you're reading this, then Thomas and Beckett have done exactly what I suspected. I'm sorry you're dealing with this while also grieving. That's not fair to you. I've known for years that my brothers would try to take what isn't theirs. They've been waiting for this opportunity since Dad chose me to run the company instead of them. The enclosed USB drive contains security footage from the house for the past 6 months. I had cameras installed when I first got sick, not because I didn't trust you, but because I didn't trust them. The envelope for Bill contains my true will, executed and witnessed properly 6 months ago, along with video testimony of my wishes. There's also a letter documenting my concerns about potential coercion. I wasn't a perfect father. I was too hard on you sometimes, expected too much. But I always believed in you, even when I didn't show it well. The company is yours if you want it. If you don't, that's okay too. It's your choice, not theirs. Trust Bill. He's been our family attorney for 30 years and knows exactly what to do. Dad, I didn't even realize I was crying until Diego awkwardly handed me a tissue from his pocket. It was clean, I checked. We took everything to Diego's place to check out the USB drive. Holy shit. Dad wasn't messing around with those security cameras. They were hidden in his bedroom, office, even the living room. Tiny things you'd never notice unless you were looking for. And they caught everything. Thomas and Beckett visiting when Dad was barely conscious. The witness they brought who never actually saw Dad sign anything. Thomas literally moving Dad's hand to sign the papers while Beckett kept lookout at the door. It was all there, in 4K resolution with timestamp and everything. Dad had basically created the perfect trap, and my uncles had walked right into it. Monday morning came, and I felt strangely calm. I'd spent Sunday night at Dad's house, slept in my old bedroom for the first time in years. The ceiling fan still made that clicking noise every third rotation that used to drive me crazy. Now it was almost comforting. I arrived at Bill Chen's office 20 minutes early, bringing Diego, Maureen, and my girlfriend Aurora, who had flown in Sunday night after I finally told her everything that was happening. Aurora's not big on family drama. Her own family is like something from a sitcom, all group hugs and inside jokes. But she held my hand the whole drive over. Bill was an older Asian man with a perfectly pressed suit and reading glasses that made him look like he stepped out of a John Grisham novel. He greeted me with this knowing look, and I immediately felt like Dad had been right about trusting him. I handed him the envelope from the safety deposit box. He nodded, unsurprised, and asked me to wait in the conference room while he reviewed the contents. Thomas and Beckett arrived 10 minutes later with their wives and kids in tow. The full show of family unity. They faltered a bit when they saw me sitting there with my own entourage, especially Maureen. Thomas tried to make some comment about non-family members at a private reading, but Bill shut that down immediately. Once everyone was seated, Bill started by explaining that there appeared to be 2 different wills, one from 6 months ago and one supposedly executed 3 weeks before Dad's death. Thomas couldn't hide his smirk. Beckett studied his fingernails like they were suddenly the most fascinating things in the world. Then Bill dropped the bombshell. Before proceeding with either document, I'd like to show everyone a video that George recorded 6 months ago when he executed his official will. The color drained from my uncle's faces so fast I thought they might pass out. Bill set up his laptop and played the video. There was Dad, looking sick but alert, sitting in this very office. He stated the date, confirmed he was of sound mind, and then spoke directly to the camera. I, George Peterson, being of sound mind, declare this to be my last will and testament. All previous wills are revoked. I'm making this video to confirm that this document reflects my true wishes and to address a concern. My brothers, Thomas and Becket Peterson, have been pressuring me to change my will in their favor. If any document appears after this date claiming to supersede this will, especially if it appears during my final days when I'm under heavy medication, I want it thoroughly investigated for coercion or fraud. Dad went on to outline his actual wishes. The house and 60% of the company's shares would go to me. Maureen would receive a generous retirement package and could stay in the guest house as long as she wanted. Kendra would receive a scholarship fund Dad had set up to help her finish her nursing degree. Thomas and Becket would each receive 10% of the company's shares and a monetary inheritance. But then came the kicker, a special clause stating that any attempt to contest the will would result in that person's inheritance being donated to charity instead. The room went absolutely silent when the video ended. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Bill calmly stated that given the video testimony, plus the security footage I'd provided showing the circumstances of the new will being signed, he would be proceeding with the original will only. Thomas exploded, started yelling about how this was all a setup, how Dad wasn't in his right mind 6 months ago, how I'd manipulated everything. Becket, always the smarter one, just sat there with his head in his hands. He knew they were screwed. Bill let Thomas rant himself out, then simply said he'd be happy to present all evidence to the court if Thomas wanted to contest the will, but reminded him of the consequences of doing so. In the end, they took their 10% shares and left with their tails between their legs. But not before Thomas hissed at me that this isn't over, and that I'd destroyed the family. Rich coming from the guy who was laughing next to my father's casket about stealing my inheritance. It's been a week since then. I've been slowly settling into Dad's house, my house now. Had to call a plumber yesterday because the upstairs toilet keeps running, and spent way too long trying to figure out Dad's weird filing system for household documents. The company stuff is going to take longer to sort out. I've been meeting with the board members individually, getting a feel for how things run. Some were clearly in my uncle's camp and aren't thrilled about me taking over, but most seem willing to give me a chance. Maureen is staying on, of course. We cleaned out the guest house together, and she's slowly moving her things in. Found her crying in Dad's closet yesterday, sorting his clothes for donation. We ended up sitting on the floor looking through old photos she had of Dad at company picnics and holiday parties. Sides of him I rarely saw. As for Thomas and Becket, they've gone radio silent. Their wives have called Aurora trying to smooth things over. But that's just code for trying to get info on what I'm planning to do next. And what am I planning? Honestly, I'm still figuring that out. Part of me wants to clean house completely, remove anyone who was loyal to my uncle. But that's not what Dad would have done. He was tough but fair. He understood that business is business, but family is complicated. Yesterday, I found myself sitting at Dad's desk, staring at his chair, trying to imagine what advice he'd give me now. I realized I was doing exactly what he used to do when faced with a hard decision. He'd sit quietly, thinking it through from every angle before making his move. Maybe I'm more like him than I thought. I don't know if this is the happy ending everyone was hoping for. My uncles are still around, still shareholders, albeit minor ones. The company has issues that need fixing. The house needs a new roof and the garage door opener is busted. But I have Dad's journal. I have his letters. I have his advice echoing in my head. And most importantly, I have the truth about what he really wanted. That's a victory worth having. Thanks for coming along on this wild ride, Reddit. Your comments helped more than you know. Might check in with another update down the road if anything crazy happens, but for now, I've got a company to learn and a toilet to fix.